Today I'm going to share two further common sources of curses. The first one proceeds from persons with relational authority. By that I mean that in the way God has ordered human society, there are relationships between persons in which one person, by virtue of the relationship, has authority over another person. For instance, a husband has authority over his wife, parents have authority over children, teachers have authority over pupils, pastors have authority over congregation. In the way God has ordered human society, there are relationships between persons in which one person, by virtue of the relationship, has authority over another person. Now we'll look at some examples. First, we'll turn to a historical example in the Bible in the life of Jacob. Jacob had lived with his uncle Laban for a long period of time. He had acquired 2 daughters, 2 concubines, 11 children, and then, without telling his uncle Laban, he just left. He fled because he was afraid of his uncle trying to hold him back or take his wives from him. His uncle Laban pursued him in anger. Now, what Jacob did not know was that his favorite wife, Rachel, before leaving, had stolen her father's household gods. The Hebrew word is teraphim, kind of little idols or images which people would keep in their homes to protect them, to bring blessing and luck, and so on. Forms of occult, which Rachel should not have been involved in, let me add. So Laban follows Jacob, catches up with him, and starts to complain about his conduct, but he comes down finally to this point. In Genesis chapter 1 verse 30, he says to Jacob, "Now you have surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house." In other words, I understand that. But why did you steal my gods? Now Jacob, not knowing who had stolen the gods, knowing that he had not done it, said this, "With whomever you find your gods, may he not live." Now that's a curse. Jacob said it in all innocence. He didn't know to whom it applied, but he was actually, as husband, pronouncing a curse on his wife Rachel. And the next time Rachel gave birth, which was not much later, she died in childbirth. That's cause and effect. It was her husband's curse that caused her death. Well, we can have other examples of persons with relational authority. As I said, parents. For instance, a father may have 3 sons. The first one is the firstborn, he's accepted. The third one is talented, he's accepted. The middle one has really nothing special to commend him. The father doesn't like him. Maybe he sees too much of himself in his son. So he is always against the son. He says, "You'll never succeed. You'll never make good in life. There's no hope for you." What's that? It's a curse. I've met many people with natural gifts and talents who could not succeed because they were struggling against a parental curse. Or a teacher may say to a pupil, "You'll never make good. You're stupid. You'll never learn to read." And what's that? It's a curse. Again, I've met people struggling against curses pronounced by teachers decades previously in their lives. Or a pastor may say to a member of his congregation, "If you leave this church, you'll never prosper. You'll never succeed. You'll backslide." What's that? It's a curse. Then there are self-imposed curses. Rebekah said to her son Jacob, "Go and get the blessing from your father Isaac." Jacob said, "Maybe my father will discover I'm a deceiver and curse me instead of blessing me." Rebekah replied, "Upon me be thy curse, my son." She pronounced a curse upon herself. If you study the story, Rebekah never saw her son Jacob alive again. She was dead by the time he returned. And we find by the end of that chapter, Rebekah is using language like this, "I'm weary of my life because of the daughters of Heth. What good will my life be to me?" That's typical language of a person under a curse. "I'm weary of my life. What good will my life be to me?" Beware of ever saying, "I wish I were dead. What's the good of living?" They are pronouncing a curse on yourself. Make a positive confession. "I shall not die, but live and declare the works of the Lord." Cancel the negative by the positive. And one final closing tragic example of a curse which has stained the pages of human history for 19 centuries. Jesus is standing before Pilate, wanting to release him. He says, "Shall I let him go?" And the crowd say, "No, crucify him." And Pilate took water, washed his hands in front of the crowd and said, "I'm innocent of the blood of this just man." The crowd replied, "His blood be on us and on our children." What's that? It's a curse, a self-imposed curse. One of the great tragedies of human history, that the Jewish people pronounced a curse on themselves and on their children. And I say with the deepest regret that subsequent history illustrates the outworking of that curse. It's still at work today. Oh, thank God that there is provision for release from the curse through the sacrificial death of the Messiah. But there is no other way out. Today I'm going to share 3 further causes of curses, all of which I've encountered many times. The first is persons representing Satan. Persons supernaturally empowered, not by God, but by Satan. Persons who've cultivated the evil power of Satan in such a way that they can release it in the lives of others. We call such persons by various names, of which here is a sample: witch doctors, wizards, witches, sorcerers, mediums, clairvoyants, fortune tellers, false prophets, and so on. Now the Bible clearly states that all who practice such things are detestable to God. Listen to what Moses said to Israel in Deuteronomy 18, verses 10 through 12. "Let no one be found among you who sacrifices his son or daughter in the fire, who practices divination or sorcery, interprets omens, engages in witchcraft, or casts spells, or who is a medium or spiritist, or who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord." Notice the list of things. I'll just pick out some. Divination, that's fortune-telling. Sorcery, interpreting omens, that could be teacup reading. Engaging in witchcraft, which is very wide. Casting spells, a medium, a spiritist, or one who consults the dead. Anyone who does these things is detestable to the Lord. Furthermore, those who resort to such persons expose themselves to satanic influences. Here's one example from the Bible of such a person, what we would call a witch doctor. Balaam. Israel had arrived at the borders of their inheritance. They were camped there on the borders of the territory of Moab. Balak, the king of Moab, was extremely frightened. He knew he could not defeat these people in war, so he resorted to a very typical practice in the Middle East today and in various other nations. He called for the witch doctor, the sorcerer, whose name was Balaam. And he asked Balaam to curse this people of whom he was afraid, whom he could not defeat in war. And so this is what he said in Numbers 22, 5 and 6. "Look, a people has come from Egypt. See, they cover the face of the earth and are settling next to me. Therefore, please come at once. Curse this people for me, for they are too mighty for me. Perhaps I shall be able to defeat them and drive them out of the land. For I know that he whom you bless is blessed, and he whom you curse is cursed." Let me tell you that that's typical practice amongst primitive tribes in Africa, even to today. If they go out to war against one another, they don't go straight to battle. First of all, they get the witch doctor to pronounce a curse on the opposing tribe, because once they're under a curse, they believe they'll be able to defeat them. Now, some people would regard this as an empty superstition, but I want to point out to you that God did not regard it that way. On the contrary, he took it very seriously, and he intervened sovereignly to prevent Balaam cursing Israel and to change the curse into the blessing. And this is what Moses told Israel later in Deuteronomy 23, verses 4 and 5. "The Moabites had against you Balaam the son of Beor from Pethor of Mesopotamia to curse you. Nevertheless, the Lord your God would not listen to Balaam. But the Lord your God turned the curse into a blessing for you, because the Lord your God loves you. God took it so seriously that he stood against Balaam and turned the curse into a blessing. You see, the Bible never says that Satan has no power. That's a mistake. The Bible clearly teaches that Satan has supernatural power. But Jesus promised his disciples superior power. In Luke 10:19 he says, "Behold, I give you the authority to trample on serpents and scorpions, and over all the power of the enemy." The enemy is Satan. "And nothing shall by any means hurt you." Don't have the impression that Satan has no power, but take refuge in this glorious fact that Jesus has given to his disciples power over all the power of Satan. Now, I want to illustrate the reality of this by a few examples from personal experience. I was for 5 years a principal of a teacher training college in East Africa, training teachers for African schools. And one of my students from a remote village told me this story. He said in the village 2 families quarreled and became very bitter against one another. So one family sent for the local witch doctor, gave him a goat as payment, and said, "Put a curse on the other family." And he said, "All right." He took the goat, he went away, and he said, "I've put a curse on the son of the other family, the little son, and at midnight on a certain day, a jackal will cry in the village, and when the jackal cries, the son of that family will die." And it happened exactly that way. A jackal cried, and the son died. That was the outworking of a curse. It has power. I think of another story. A friend of mine, a pastor of a church, in order to raise funds for the church, some of the members organized what they call a garden fete. And they had all sorts of entertainments and attractions to amuse people. And one of them was a fortune teller, which they regarded simply as a joke. So the pastor really didn't feel too happy about this, but he went along with the plan, and he went into the fortune teller's tent to have his fortune told, and the fortune teller said to him, "Your wife will get cancer." He told me afterwards his blood ran cold and his heart almost stopped beating. And you know what happened? His wife got cancer. Praise God, through prayer and faith and the help of doctors, she was ultimately healed. But you see, that man had unwittingly exposed himself to a curse from a servant of Satan, which affected his wife. Let me give you another experience of my own in Chicago some years back. I was pastoring a church. A lady came to me, told me that she'd been a spiritist medium, that she wanted deliverance. I was somewhat skeptical, but I began to pray with her and to drive out the power of Satan from her life. It was very hard going. And in the middle, I stopped and rested for a few moments, and suddenly she looked at me, and she said, "I see you in a car, and it's wrecked against a tree." And I realized that was Satan's destiny for my life being pronounced through the lips of that woman. Thank God I was on the alert. I said, "I'll never be in any car that will be wrecked against a tree. I reject that curse. It has no power over me." And I was free. But if I had said, "Oh, I'm going to be in a car, it's going to be wrecked against a tree," I would have accepted that curse, and it would have worked out in my life. Now, another cause of curses is soulish prayers, utterance, and gossip. Listen to what James says in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15. "But if you have bitter envy and self-seeking in your hearts, do not boast and lie against the truth. This wisdom does not descend from above, but is earthly, sensual, demonic." You see, people can talk against one another and even pray against one another. And in doing so, if they're not in the realm of the spirit, if they're in the realm of the soul, if they're in bad and evil emotions, the effect of their prayers is a curse. I was in a church some little while back where there was a group of people connected with the church actually praying for the death of the pastor's wife. What's that? It's a curse. It was the result of bitterness and hatred and division in the church. You see, we can kill people with our tongues. Do you realize that? In Jeremiah's day, the people who opposed him said this in Jeremiah 18:18. "Come and let us devise plans against Jeremiah. Come on and let us strike at him with our tongue, and let us give no heed to any of his words." Do you know that many servants of God have died through being struck by the tongue of gossip and soulish utterances and prayers? That can be the source of a curse. Finally, one other source. Unscriptural covenants by which people commit themselves to persons who are themselves committed to false gods. God said through Moses to Israel, "You shall make no covenant with them." nor with their gods. If you make covenant with people who are in false religions and worshipping false gods, not only do you make a covenant with the people, but you make a covenant with their gods.